Good evening. My name is Don Duncan, and you have joined us tonight for a live Google Hangout. The title tonight is The Truth About Medical Marijuana Regulations in California. Thank you so much for being a part of it. I'm broadcasting live tonight from Sacramento, California, from our Capitol office with the support and help from our friends in Washington, D.C., the ASA staff there who's helping us with the technical side of this. So if you're joining us tonight on Google, we're going to have a time for your comments, your questions a little bit later in the broadcast. And so be sure you open the live chat option on the left-hand side of your screen. If you're watching on YouTube, you can still leave comments and questions, but those will not be broadcast live. So thanks again for being a part of this. It's really great to have all of you here tonight. Americans for Safe Access is the nation's leading medical cannabis patients advocacy organization. And you're talking tonight about the California Campaign for Safe Access. California is the oldest and perhaps largest medical cannabis state. There are probably more doctors, patients, and providers in this state than anywhere else. And so tonight we're going to be talking about medical cannabis regulations in the state of California. And California occupies a strange and unusual place when it comes to medical cannabis in the United States because we pioneered medical cannabis. We broke new ground back in 1996 with this, and yet we've kind of fallen behind when it comes to regulating the commercial provision of medical cannabis in the state of California. And so tonight we're going to be talking about where we are right now, where we're going, and why it matters with medical cannabis regulation. And I also want to talk to you about what is in some bills that we're going to talk about that are pending right now in the state legislature. If you've been following this conversation online through our email discussion list or on our email announcement list, you know already that California is in the middle of the legislative process for this year. And I'm going to show you some web pages right now. These are some pages where you can go to get updates, to join that discussion list, or to keep tabs on the pending legislation. And right now we're at this really historic crossroads in California because the state legislature is finally moving forward on regulating medical cannabis in the state of California. And so it's time now for patients and for caregivers and for other folks who care about medical cannabis to be involved in that process. And so let me just make sure you guys are checking back in. There we go. Okay. And so let me talk to you a little bit about how we got to where we are right now. Voters in California approved Proposition 215 back in 1996. That was 19 years ago. And so Proposition 215 legalized medical cannabis, but it didn't really say anything about how you would get it if you don't grow up for yourself or you don't have a primary caregiver who grows it for you. And so almost immediately in California, an industry began to evolve to meet the needs of patients, to provide them with cannabis, to grow it, to process it, and provide it in their communities. And that industry existed in sort of a legal vacuum for a while. It wasn't until 12 years ago that the state legislature approved the Medical Marijuana Program Act, commonly known as SB 420. And the Medical Marijuana Program Act created some vague guidelines for medical cannabis in California. It created a voluntary ID card program. It dealt with some of the minutia about using medical cannabis on probation and other details like that. But most importantly, what the Medical Marijuana Program Act did is it created a system of collective and cooperative associations, cultivation associations that could also maintain storefronts to distribute medical cannabis to their members. And this was really a watershed moment in California. And up until this time, our model in California has been based on this collective and cooperative model that was sort of implied and outlined in the Medical Marijuana Program Act, but not specifically speaking regulated or fleshed out in its details. And so for many years now, for the last 12 years, we've been operating in this quasi-gray zone, these collective and cooperative associations that are legal and have been upheld by the courts in California, but the details really haven't been established under state law. And so cities and counties in California have developed a whole patchwork of regulations or of bans of medical cannabis activity. We've seen in cities and counties, almost 200 of them have actually banned medical marijuana facilities. And more recently, we've seen cities and counties moving to ban the cultivation of medical cannabis. And in some really unfortunate situations, even the cultivation of personal use medical cannabis. That's individual patients or primary caregivers growing for the personal use of medical cannabis patients. And so this whole patchwork for the regulation of medical cannabis is increasingly untenable in California. All around the country right now, states have begun to develop and implement regulatory models that are based on licensing and regulation of medical cannabis. And California has really fallen behind. We're behind the curve on this situation. And so we really need to step up at this moment in time and make it real in California. And this is important because state regulatory agencies are getting involved now, and the state legislature is taking notice. And if we don't participate in the regulatory process in Sacramento right now, regulations for medical cannabis will be something that happen to Californians and not with Californians. And so we really need to be involved in this. Not only have cities and counties moved ahead with bans and regulations, or in some cases, nothing, but we're also now seeing state regulatory agents like the Board of Equalization, which assesses sales tax in California, becoming more and more assertive in the regulation of medical cannabis. We see the Department of Fish and Wildlife imposing regulations on the cultivation of medical cannabis, and the water boards dealing now with the cultivation of cannabis, both indoors and outdoors. And so it's really time now for the state of California to come up with what other states are doing, and that is a comprehensive regulatory model for medical cannabis. And so that's what we're talking about tonight, is a comprehensive model for medical cannabis that works for California. Now, here's what's really, really important for California. We differ from these other states because California pioneered medical cannabis in 1996, and we have here an established industry in California that's providing medical cannabis for legal patients. And that's very important. In places like Nevada, where I've had the opportunity to work on the implementation process and the regulatory process, there was no legal or quasi-legal industry for medical cannabis. And here there is. And so it's really, really important that the state of California develop these regulations in respect of and in consideration of that existing industry. And so since 2003, I should say, the state legislature has not been willing or able to adopt any legislation related to medical cannabis, at least any meaningful legislation related to medical cannabis in the state of California. And so we're really at a strange impasse because we need to do it, but our state lawmakers haven't been willing to do it. And a part of the reason that they're not willing to do it is has up until now been very little political upside to regulating medical cannabis. Standing up for medical cannabis made you vulnerable to attacks that maybe you're soft on drugs or you're pro-marijuana, and there was no upside to doing that. But everything started to change last year. Last year, we saw a sea change in the state of California because some of our traditional opponents abandoned 20 years of opposition to medical cannabis and came out in support of regulations. Now, the motives of some of our traditional opponents differ from our motives. They're not embracing regulation for the reason we are. And the reason that we embrace regulation is because our research and our experience shows that sensible regulations for medical cannabis preserve safe access for legal patients while reducing crime and complaints in communities. And that's been borne out over 20 years of experience in California. Our opponents are looking at the changing political landscape, and they're seeing that legalization is on the horizon in California and that medical cannabis is here to stay, and they've come to the table reluctantly. These opponents include people like the California Narcotics Officers Association and the California Police Chiefs Association and the California League of Cities, who up until last year steadfastly opposed any regulation. And they said, we will not come to the table and negotiate about medical cannabis. But last year, when they saw that legalization might be on the table and that there was this confusing patchwork of regulations around the state, they came to the table and brought with them their opinions and their priorities and their strategies for regulating medical cannabis. We had a choice to make at that point last year. We could have decided that we would stand aside and say, no, we don't want to talk to our opponents. We don't want to regulate on their terms. We don't want to talk on their terms. We don't want to deal with this issue in California. But we decided that was the wrong strategy. And so we came to the table and met them where they were to regulate medical cannabis in California. And we've seen a tremendous amount of progress so far in the effort. We didn't get a bill passed last year. There were several proposals but we didn't get one passed. But we saw a lot of progress, and we identified a lot of common ground with our traditional opponents. The reason that's important is because we by ourselves don't have the clout to make that kind of an impact in California. The California League of Cities, which represents the interest of cities around California, municipalities at the state legislature, and the California Police Chiefs Association, which represents the interest of law enforcement, have a lot of clout in California. Now, we've done a lot to build our coalition, both of legislative supporters and to branch out into places like organized labor and so on to build our clout. But we needed to come together. And when we saw these guys come to the table last year, we realized there was an opportunity for real progress. And that's a part of the process we're involved in right now, is the process to build a coalition that can get a bill passed in Sacramento and make a real difference, and to secure, finally, in California, the proven benefits of regulations for medical cannabis patients and their caregivers. And so this is a complicated process. And so now that we've got all of the players at the table, the cities, the counties, law enforcement, medical cannabis patients, and industry, we're ready to talk about legalization. And I believe right now, regulation, and I believe right now the issue of legalization is pushing this conversation forward. A lot of people believe that in 2016, in November of 2016, there'll be a voter initiative on the ballot that legalizes cannabis for adult use, for the use of responsible adults in California, not just medical cannabis patients, but responsible adults. And that's an exciting and perhaps even a little bit worrisome prospect for medical cannabis, because we know there can be unintended consequences. And we also know that this legalization movement is not inevitable, and that there's a lot of ground to cover between now and then to be sure that patients and other cannabis consumers are protected in a legal environment. We've seen many different models around the state, and the outcome of that is actually a conversation for a different Google Hangout, frankly. In Washington State, it hasn't gone so well. Patients have given up some ground for legalization. In Oregon, they're still trying to work it out. And in Colorado, we've seen two parallel programs, medical and non-medical, existing side by side without interfering with one another. And so there are many different paths that could take in California, but that pending vote on legalization in November of 2016, which by the way, may or may not happen, and it may or may not pass, but that pending vote, that possibility of that vote, is really driving the effort right now in California to regulate medical cannabis. And I think it should, because we're past time for regulating medical cannabis in California. And if you believe in the legalization of marijuana, we really need to get medical cannabis handled so it's not an anchor to that campaign. And so, having said that, let's talk a little bit about what's happening in California right now. This year, in 2015, there were a tremendous number of proposals on the table for what to do about medical cannabis. And all of these proposals, about a dozen or so in total, they dealt with things like standards for cultivation, how to deal with manufacturing concentrates of cannabis, primarily with butane. They dealt with patients' rights issues and return of property, but primarily with the commercial regulation of medical cannabis. So before we dig into that in detail, let me also point out that one of the patients' rights issues we can be very proud of is that we have secured in California, through an ACES-sponsored piece of legislation, the Medical Cannabis the Medical Cannabis Organ Transplant Act, the right of a medical cannabis patient to stay on the organ transplant list, even though they use medical cannabis. And so that's a tremendous victory. Left on the table are these concentrates and regulation and evidence handling bills. And so we're going to deal tonight with the issues around commercial regulation of medical cannabis. Now, we're not talking here about the commercial regulation of medical cannabis as it pertains to individuals. Individual patients and caregivers are largely off the table right now when it comes to the regulatory debate. And that's great, because we don't want a situation where the state legislature is interfering in the rights of individual patients and primary caregivers that are guaranteed under Proposition 215. Now, the state legislature does not have the constitutional authority to take back any rights under Proposition 215. They can take back rights under SB 420, but they don't have the rights to come in and roll back Proposition 215. And none of the proposals on the table right now do that. And so that's not by accident. That's because ASA and other organizations fought very hard to see to it that these commercial regulation bills did not step on the rights of individual patients or their primary caregivers to cultivate and use and possess medicine for their own personal use. So right now we have numerous bills on the table. I'm going to start tonight by talking about AB 243. This is a bill by Assemblymember Wood that deals with cultivation. And then we're going to talk about medical cannabis commercial regulation in two separate bills. One is SB 643 by Senator McGuire, and the other is AB 266 by Assemblymember Bonta and numerous other co-authors. I'm going to move relatively quickly, and before we get into the details of these bills, I want to refer you to the comments section of the Google Hangout or YouTube, if you're watching on YouTube, where you'll find links by Courtney Sheets. Courtney is doing some great work with us here in Sacramento, and she put up links today to all of the three bills we're about to discuss and to our memo that we sent to state lawmakers about AB 266. And so if you haven't already clicked on those links to look at these summaries, that's the best place to get the most comprehensive analysis of what the bills do. There's a lot in these bills. And so if you're new to reading legislation and you click on those links and you're like, wow, this is a lot, up to 60 pages of text in one place, I want to encourage you to focus on the Legislative Council's Digest, which is the first thing you're going to see on the links to the bills. It's a nonpartisan, impartial analysis of what the bill does. It's your best place to look to see what these bills do. And so we're going to start off our conversation about AB 243, Assembly Bill 243 by Assemblymember Wood. And this is a bill that seeks to regulate medical cannabis cultivation in California. And then we're going to get to the two other bills. I'm going to move quickly here because we have a lot to cover in the next 45 minutes or so. So AB 243 is a bill that has already passed the state assembly. It's now pending in the state senate. And this bill creates the Division of Medical Cannabis Cultivation in the Department of Food and Agriculture. So the Department of Food and Agriculture is an existing state regulatory agency, and this would create a new division in that agency. It would require that anyone who grows marijuana in the state of California, with the exception of individual patients or primary caregivers, to obtain a conditional use permit from the city or county in which they operate. The bill also requires these cultivators to obtain a new permit from the division that's created, and this is for both indoor and outdoor cultivation. The bill would require this new division created in Food and Agriculture to create a tracking program that tracks each individual plant cultivated in the state of California. Each individual plant would have a unique tracking number, and it would impose a $50 per plant tax on medical cannabis. Finally, that bill would require cultivators to meet environmental standards when it comes to cultivation. That is, standards for water usage and fertilizers and land grading and so forth, all of which exist already in California. Now, that last topic is actually a worthwhile goal. We do want medical cannabis cultivators to meet existing environmental standards, but ASA opposes AB 243 in its current form because we do not believe that this individual plant tracking model is the right way to go. There is no crop in California that we track per plant. There's no rule that says you have to track each individual tomato plant, each individual artichoke, or what have you. That's just not practical. And we know that that has worked in counties on the local level, but it will not work on a state level. And we really want the author here, Assemblymember Wood, to join in the larger conversation about regulation and not have this sort of standalone commercial regulation bill. It's not a good idea to have one bill passing that's a comprehensive regulation bill and another bill passing that just regulates cultivation. And so we've called on the assembly member and his staff and other lawmakers to put this bill on hold. They can bring it up next year if they want and not adopt this bill right now and wait and see what happens. I also want to say that it is inappropriate under AB 243 to assess what is essentially a sin tax on medical cannabis. That is not okay. This is real medicine. Research shows that patients in California, the vast majority, 92%, are getting real relief from serious medical conditions. And so the sort of cynical interpretation that most medical cannabis patients are just gaming the system and just trying to get high, it's not supported by scientific research. And we don't want a sin tax that treats cannabis like alcohol or tobacco. That is inappropriate. Medical cannabis is real medicine, and it should be regulated like real medicine. And so if there's a cost of regulation, it's okay for that to be borne by industry. But you don't just put an arbitrary tax on top of medical cannabis, because that cost flows through to the individual patients, and that is not okay. And so ASA is opposing AB 243 by Assemblymember Wood unless it is substantially amended. And I want to point out that we really, really, really want for the author to join Assemblymember Bonta, Senator McGuire, and the other co-authors in developing a comprehensive regulatory model for medical cannabis. This kind of standalone legislation is really not terribly helpful right now. Before we move on to the other two regulatory bills, I see several questions have popped up already. I will get to them really soon, I promise. So stand by and be patient. I'll be with you guys in just a minute. But now we're going to move to, I think, what is the meat of this conversation, and that is AB 266 by Assemblymember Bonta and SB 643 by Senator McGuire. And first of all, let me just quickly talk about SB 643. SB 643 is a well-intended bill that seeks to regulate medical cannabis. It's much less developed than AB 266, and we have also encouraged Senator McGuire to join with his colleagues in the Assembly and merge SB 643 with AB 266 so that these two bills can move forward as one unified regulatory scheme. We don't particularly oppose anything in the McGuire bill. We think it's a good start, but it's not enough. And we hope that any priorities or deal-breaking compromises that exist there, that the authors can work out together. I've encouraged them to do that. I don't know what's happening in private between authors, and so we hope for the best. We don't want, again, another 2, maybe 3 regulatory models to pass in California. We want one regulatory model in the state of California. I actually call this the Lord of the Rings approach to regulation. We want one bill to rule them all. And so we've asked the author to bring his good ideas to the table and be a part of the debate about AB 266. Now, AB 266 is a really big bill. It's over 60 pages long. And I want to tell you, in terms of AB 266, that I've actually spent in the last, since Thursday, I've spent more than 20 hours in meetings or in work regarding this bill. It is a huge, giant behemoth, and it's complicated, it's nuanced, and it's always changing. The link on the Google Hangout and on the Yahoo group right now is to the version from June 30th. And just this morning, we were working on a new mock-up that has even more changes. I know that's frustrating. It's frustrating to me too, because many of you are sitting out there and you're worried about regulations or concerned about regulations, and you're looking at these resources the state has published, and it's frustrating to know that they're not the most up-to-date versions and that there are conversations happening. That's not a medical cannabis problem. That's actually a problem with the way that California passes laws. It is not transparent, it's not accessible, and it's not timely. And that's regrettable, and all I can say on that topic is that I'm doing my best to keep our grassroots base informed of this process. And again, if you want to look at those web pages that I showed you earlier, that is where you're always going to find the absolute most accurate information about legislation in California, the conversation about what's happening with regulation, and about the broader campaign. And so I want to encourage you to make note of the web pages that you see right now on your screen, because this is where you'll see the latest versions, the latest publications from Americans for Safe Access about these bills, and it's where you're going to find the people who are talking right now about medical cannabis and regulations in the state of California. So please do make note of that. And if you're not on our mailing list, go to our website and get on it right away. So let's talk for a minute about AB 266. And then I want to leave some time, a lot of time, for questions and comments about these bills and about the state legislative process. And so AB 266, the primary author is Assemblymember Banta. Co-authors are Assemblymembers Cooley, Jones-Sawyer, Lackey, and Chu. And if you know politics, you know it's strange to see Lackey there. He's a Republican, and this is actually a bipartisan effort to regulate medical cannabis. I believe AB 266 is our best chance yet to have sensible, comprehensive regulations for commercial medical cannabis operation in California, which is not to say it's a perfect bill. Politics is all about compromise. You come to the table, there's something you want, there's something your opponents want, there's something other stakeholders want, and politics is the art of assimilating all of these wants into something we can all agree on. That may not satisfy all of our constituents, and I understand that, but you have to understand, just like we don't get everything we want with AB 266, law enforcement and cities and other stakeholders don't get everything they want with AB 266. And sometimes in Sacramento, they say, you know when you've done your job when nobody's completely happy. And that's where we're at with AB 266. Americans for Safe Access is supporting AB 266 because we strongly support commercial regulations for medical cannabis in the state of California. However, we know there are shortcomings, and we know there are things that may have to be fixed later in the legislative process or in the rulemaking process, because AB 266 creates numerous divisions to regulate medical cannabis, and there will be ample opportunities to create and refine the regulations in California when these new divisions are created. And so I want everyone to know that we're supporting AB 266 because we believe in regulations, and we know that they work for patients, and we believe that the current version of AB 266 is workable for industry, if not ideal. And so I want to encourage everyone in this process to be pragmatic. There's still time, a little bit of time, for improving the bill. But even if we don't get the perfect bill, we can make a huge leap forward in California by approving AB 266 this year. So here's a quick rundown. And again, I want to encourage you to look at the Legislative Council's digest and the links provided on the Google page and on the YouTube page. But basically, AB 266 will create in the governor's office the Office of Medical Cannabis Regulation, which will have overall oversight of medical cannabis regulation in California. This is actually a huge victory for us, because until now, the Division of Alcoholic Beverage Control was considered the primary candidate for regulation. And we're really lucky that didn't carry the day. ASA spent 2 years fighting ABC regulation of medical cannabis, because we don't believe that medicine should be regulated in California like a vice, like alcohol or tobacco. We believe medicine should be regulated like medicine. And so we scored a huge victory in AB 266 by getting oversight in the governor's office, as opposed to into the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control. Under this oversight of the governor's office, we have the Division of Medical Cannabis Regulation, created in the Board of Legalization, which will regulate dispensaries and people who transport medical cannabis. We have the Division of Medical Cannabis Manufacturing and Testing that is in the Department of Public Health, which, by the way, I think is a great regulatory agency for medical cannabis. And they're going to deal with issues around manufacturing, that is making products out of cannabis, out of raw cannabis, and of testing cannabis, which is a very important emerging field in medical cannabis. And then finally, we have the Division of Medical Cannabis Cultivation, which finally is in the right place. It's in the Department of Food and Agriculture. And so they're going to regulate the cultivation of medical cannabis. The bill is based on a dual licensing model, and we're going to talk about the pros and cons of that in a minute. What that means is that a medical cannabis business will need the approval of their local jurisdiction, the city or county in which they're located, and the state of California. It has a provisional licensing scheme, which allows for existing medical cannabis businesses to be licensed immediately to continue to provide services while the final licensing program unfolds. There's an 18-month delay in the licensing provisions, which is really significant in this bill because it doesn't ban access right away. It gives leeway for obtaining your local and your state license. It authorizes some additional taxation. Again, we don't like that, but it may be the cost of doing business in the state of California. And it also has some provisions that deal with doctors who recommend medical cannabis. I want to deal with that last one really quickly because I think it's the simplest. The provisions about doctors require that you obtain your recommendation from an attending physician and that attending physician has no economic interest in a medical cannabis provider. That actually parallels the prescribing of prescription drugs in California and frankly in every other state in the United States. Doctors are not allowed to have an economic interest in a pharmacy because that might encourage them to prescribe drugs so they could sell them in their pharmacy as opposed to just prescribe them for the welfare of the patient. So I hope that's not controversial. That first provision about attending physicians, I think people misunderstand. The bill does not require that you obtain your medical marijuana recommendation from your primary care physician. That's an individual, and that definition is very severe. But your attending physician is only someone who is given you a good faith prior exam and a diagnosis for a legitimate medical condition. That is already the standard established under the Medical Marijuana Program Act, SB 420 in California. So we are not breaking new ground. Now, to a certain extent, that provision has only been honored in the breach here in California, and so this law might bring that more compliance in California. However, the enforcement of this falls to the California Medical Board. They've been really absent in the enforcement of medical cannabis so far. So whether or not they choose to listen to the state legislature and make this enforcement a higher priority, we don't know. But we're not really giving up very much, or frankly, any ground when it comes to medical cannabis and doctors in AB 266. And so I don't want anyone to worry about doctors going to jail or no more recommendations available. This bill does very little to regulate doctors in the state of California. So moving then back through some of these provisions, this dual licensing thing is complicated in California because local control is a big issue for California, not just in medical cannabis, but in the broader scheme of California when we're dealing with water rights and the drought, when we're dealing with alcohol sales, when we're dealing with land use and zoning. Cities and counties in California really, really want local control, and they want it for medical cannabis as well. By the way, they'll also want it for legal cannabis for adult use as well. So this conversation is not going to go away with AB 266. Local control is a deeply held value of the state of California, and it is a commonly held perception that medical cannabis and any other issue dealing with local sovereignty would be subordinate to cities and counties. That's not great for patients, but it's where we're at. The California Supreme Court ruled in the Riverside decision, Riverside versus Inland Empire Patients Wellness Center, that nothing in existing state law prohibits a city and county from banning medical cannabis dispensaries. Other appellate court decisions seem to extend that provision to cultivation. That is bad for patients. And let me be clear about this. Americans for Safe Access does not support local bans. We do not think it's a good idea. But we may have temporarily lost that battle. Not forever. It's not a done deal. But right now, the state legislature, there's not one single lawmaker who will push back on local control. Not our champions, not the people who always stand up for us. Nobody is ready to push back. And so we are stuck right now in a situation where cities and counties are being required to approve medical cannabis activity before the state will license it. And we're going to have to work on that. Now, the concession that Americans for Safe Access negotiated way back in February, before this whole debate went public, was this. If you're going to require local control for medical cannabis, there must be a delay in the effective date of when that approval needs to apply, because people need to go to their city council and their board of supervisors and negotiate. And so we did, in fact, secure that concession. We asked for 2 years. Our opponents asked for a 1-year delay. We settled in the middle, and 18 months is what's in the bill right now. Providers, dispensaries, manufacturers, they all have 18 months to operate before they're required to have a local and a state permit. I know that's not perfect, but what that means is that if you're in a city or county that has not approved medical cannabis operations, whether that be dispensing or cultivation, you have an 18-month deadline to do your legwork and get your city and county up to speed with this dual licensing and authorize medical cannabis activity. Now, I have asked as recently as today, this afternoon, I was meeting with the authors and their staff, and I've asked for exemptions, exceptions, other ways that we can deal with local control. Specifically, what ASA proposes is that if you're in a city and county that neither bans nor authorizes medical cannabis activity, that the state is allowed to authorize that activity. I don't know if we're going to get it, but if we don't, then it falls back to the local level. You know, Tip O'Neill said all politics is local. It may fall back to that level to fight that battle and get a license and permit. But I also want to say to you, if you're in a jurisdiction that does not allow dispensaries or does not allow cultivation, this bill is not the end of that fight. And I want to promise you, we're going to keep fighting for your right to access and to cultivate your own medicine in the state of California, because that right is fundamental for medical cannabis patients. And even if we can't get it this year in AB 266, we're going to keep fighting for it later on. So those are some of the key provisions of AB 266, the bill. There's a lot more in there. Like I said, it's 60 pages. It's complicated. It's got labor provisions. It's got environmental provisions. I want to encourage you to read it. I want to encourage you to think about it, to talk about it, to get on our discussion list and debate it with other medical cannabis advocates. And I want to tell you that our discussion list, unlike some of the others in the state, is really, really an important place to talk about medical cannabis. You're going to see it there in the middle. It's safeaccessnow.org/ASA-CCSA- et cetera. You'll see it there. That is a place where some really important people in the state of California are talking about medical cannabis right now. And so I really want to encourage you to get on that list and talk about these bills, because this conversation is not necessarily open and closed this year. This conversation is ongoing. And so even if we don't get in California the final bill for patients right now, we're going to get it in California eventually, and we're going to keep fighting. Now, I see right now that it's 8:36, and as usual, I've gone on too long. I want to encourage you, if you have questions or comments about the bills, what you think about the prospects that are on the table, what you think about the future, what you think about medical cannabis and legalization in 2016, now's the time to start typing those things, because I want to make as much space for you in this process as possible. I also want to sort of wrap up our conversation with AB 266 while you're typing your questions into the comment box. And again, look at the left-hand side of your screen to activate chats, and they'll pop up on the right-hand side of your screen. That's where you'll see the comments. And I want to encourage you to think about this. Every single industry in California is regulated at some level. The tomatoes that you get at the farmer's market, the gasoline you buy at the pump, even the shoes you buy at the mall, they're all regulated at some level by the state government. I know there are a handful of folks out there who are saying, oh, let's don't regulate, let's don't do it. And I want to reiterate what I started with. If they don't regulate with us, they're going to regulate on us. They're going to do it to us if we don't participate. And so we need to be a part of this regulatory process in California. And so it's so important that you plug in and talk to your lawmakers, because they need to know that while they're hearing from doctors in the CMA, they're hearing from law enforcement, they're hearing from cities and counties and other stakeholders, they need to hear from you too. And so it's really, really important that you're plugged in on this, because there are going to be regulations for cannabis in California, and we need to be plugged in and a part of that process. I also want to tell you this, based on my absolutely sincere analysis of this bill sets up some hurdles for the industry of medical cannabis. It sets up some hoops to jump through, some barriers to entry, and we're doing our best to mitigate that. But this bill is good for patients. We know regulation is good for patients, and I really want to encourage all of you, including those of you who have a financial stake in the medical cannabis industry, to think about the fact that this bill is good for patients, and what's good for patients is good for the industry. Now, I see some of you are typing in questions. I'm going to start at the top. Be patient, and then we're going to come back a little bit later to wrap all of this up. And so, let's see. Question: why is it so hard to get CBD oils for topical use? That question, not specifically related to regulations, although if medical cannabis were legal under federal law, you could get those more easily all over the country. And so I would encourage this person asking this question to look into what's available nationwide and to support our efforts to reform federal medical cannabis law. And if you have an urgent need, get in touch with us at ASA, and we'll see what we can do to help you out. Question number 2. Will California have caregiver growers? Good question. I'm actually glad you mentioned that because I sort of glossed over this before. And so AB 266 and SB 643 do not regulate individual patients or primary caregivers. But keep in mind that primary caregivers are people who have consistently provided for the housing, safety, or welfare of the qualified patient. And so these bills do not overturn the primary caregiver status, but they also bring into the regulatory fold the collective and cooperative model. None of these bills envision that the collective and cooperative model, what we currently have in California, goes on indefinitely. They all phase it out. And so, yes, there can be collective and cooperative cultivation, but it has to come in to the regulatory scheme, and it has to be a part of that licensing program. So there will not be a place under these bills for what I guess I would call a caregiver, in air quotes, who is just growing for patients in general. If you're an actual caregiver for 5 or fewer patients, you're exempt. And if you're going to be involved in the commercial cultivation of cannabis to provide that medicine to the free market of cannabis in California, then you do have to be regulated. So I guess the answer to that question is yes and no. The next question actually is surprising. It says, did Jeff Perrone open the first medical cannabis dispensary? And then it says, in sorts. And I believe this person is referring to Dennis Perrone. Dennis Perrone, a great crusader for the rights of medical cannabis patients in San Francisco. And Dennis Perrone, as far as I know, did open the first medical cannabis dispensary in 1996 in San Francisco. And we should all give props to the pioneering work he did and to the large group of advocates largely associated with the HIV and AIDS advocacy movement who really stood up and made that possible, because none of this would have happened if it weren't for Dennis Perrone in San Francisco. So thank you, Dennis, for doing it. And yes, it's not Jeff, it's Dennis Perrone. So next question down, and be patient with me. These scroll past fast on the screen. Why is it only for the people with deep pockets that are allowed to grow? Us poor people want to grow also. Legalization will not prevent micro grows, just like micro brews. That is a very good point. And first of all, let me reiterate, the regulatory bills on the table do not prevent individual patients or primary caregivers who serve 5 or fewer patients from cultivating their own medical cannabis. That's something ASA has always fought for. I wish that number were higher. I would like to see 20, 25 patients. But politically speaking, we got what we could get, and it's 5 or fewer patients. And so individual patients can still grow their marijuana, even if all of these bills pass. If any or all of them pass, patients are exempt. I want that to be really clear. Now, we've also been fighting very hard, along with our allies in industry, to make sure that all of the regulatory schemes have a tiered licensing program to include small growers, because we want to make sure that existing industry in California that's serving patients right now is included in the regulatory model. And AB 266 has really gone above and beyond the call of duty in segregating this licensing process so that small, medium, and large cultivators and providers are still included in the process. And so of all the bills, the most, I guess, egalitarian of them is AB 266, because it anticipates small growers participating in the process. It's imperfect, and you know what? Those small growers are going to have an additional cost to bear, but they do have a place to move forward. And it's funny that the person who asked the question asked about microbrews, because that is exactly the conversation we had for 5 hours on Thursday and another 5 hours this morning, is that, what's the model in California relative to alcohol? And that microbrew conversation was a big part of it. We want to make sure that the small cultivars are there. I want to point out that one of the reasons that's really important in the state of California is that there are niche markets for medical cannabis that the broader movement for legalization may never serve. If you need a high CBD strain to treat the epilepsy from which your child is suffering, the recreational market may not accommodate that. Market forces may not push people to develop and provide and to provide in a retail setting high CBD anti-epilepsy medicine for a small number of children who need it. But the medical cannabis market can. And so that's one of the great things about including the small players, is that we can make sure that small niches of patients are served. Moving down, it says, are the feds going to ever back off? What's up with Harborside? Well, that's two questions. And so first of all, the answer is yes. I believe the feds are already backing off. Now, I don't want anyone to think we're out of the woods on federal interference and intimidation. Tomorrow, the federal government could come crashing back through California and raid gardens and shut down dispensaries and doctors and all of that. We have not changed federal law. And that's one reason it's so important that we support comprehensive federal reform to change federal law. Federal reform like the CARES Act, which would finally require that the federal government respect the state medical cannabis laws. And so don't think just because California is moving forward finally that we're done with this fight. We're not done with the fight for medical cannabis until we change federal law. And so that's really important. And there are other bills too about banking and taxation and whatever in Congress that we have to fight for. So we're not done until we're done on the state and the federal level. So I hope everyone's going to stay plugged in that process. In terms of what's up with Harborside, I think this question is about their asset forfeiture case. And that case is really dragging on. And I just want to say thank you and congratulations to Harborside and their attorneys for fighting that fight and for carrying on and persevering, because the federal government is trying to use asset forfeiture laws to shut down medical cannabis in California and other states by targeting landlords. And Harborside has been heroic. And I also want to point out they're spending huge amounts of money to fight that fight. So I want to say thank you to them. And the answer to what's up with that is I don't know, because in federal court, things always take forever. And we don't have the final word yet on what the outcome of the Harborside case is. They're fighting an uphill battle. They're fighting a huge adversary. And in my opinion, they're doing a great job of it. Someone else says, thanks, Don. Great hangout. Great. Thank you. All right. One more question here I see on my screen. What will the permit application process be like for those seeking commercial permits under AB 266? Very good question. And well, the answer is this. It's going to be complicated and probably expensive. And I understand that is disappointing for folks, because I know that we all would like a simple application process. But the fact is, in other states where commercial medical cannabis applications and programs are already underway and functioning, the complication is big. The application rather is big and complicated, and the process can be expensive. Now in California, we're lucky because California agencies are forbidden from charging fees in excess of what it costs to regulate and provide a service. And so they can't just keep stacking on and being like, oh, we need an extra $10,000 for whatever purpose. They have to charge fees related to the cost of providing the service, but that could be expensive. And I would not be surprised to see application fees upwards of $10,000. Now, I don't know, that's not based on any number that I've seen from the state. That's based on what I've seen around the country. And so that may be the cost of doing business. And I guess what I would say in that regard is that these fees will probably be more reasonable than what we've seen in other states. And they're going to be borne uniformly across the industry. So we hope there will be no competitive disadvantage. We also hope that the final fee structures that are developed by the regulatory agencies respect the different licensing classes that are small, medium, and large as far as cultivation, distribution, and processing goes. Now, what the application process looks like depends on the state regulators, but there's going to be some application form. It will involve a background check to make sure that you meet what they call the suitability requirements. That is, felony convictions for certain kinds of crimes, usually related to drug trafficking and moral turpitude and what have you. There'll be security plans and local approval things that you have to prove. Lots of things you have to establish in order to get your state license. And so it's going to be complicated. And that's the way that we see already with, say, alcohol permits or other kind of special permitting, is that there's a long process to go through, which is one of the reasons why we've allowed 18 months and we've asked for this delay in effective dates, because on the local and state level, it's going to take a little bit of time to get in compliance. I do want to point out, however, that if you are an already existing operator in California who's already operating in local and state compliance, whether that be with your local ordinances or SB 420, you're going to get a provisional license and be allowed to continue operating under AB 266. So there's not a shutdown. There's not like a dark period where everybody has to shut down and come into compliance. I see another question rolled up. This is a long one. It says, why 5 patients is free and over is considered commercial grower? Big hoop for a caregiver, too big for caregiver. I'm summarizing a little bit. Micro grower, small, medium, large is an interesting idea. Carrying on with this question, trying to hash out a caregiver model for nation. New bills in committee here in Massachusetts. No medical cannabis bills make it out of committee. Tough battle. That's a very good point. Thanks again for the great hangout. And so this person is apparently writing in from Massachusetts. Thanks for joining us. It's great to have somebody from out of state. And the question for why 5 patients per caregiver is the standard is going to disappoint some of you. And the answer is that's a political compromise. That's politically workable in California right now. Again, I proposed 20 patients per caregiver who's unregulated, and frankly, the authors and the regulators and the other stakeholders rather were not willing to go with that. And so what we have right now is 5. It is a big hoop, and I wish we could do better, but that's where we're at in California right now. Remember, in the political process, we all come to the table, law enforcement, cities, and other stakeholders and patients, and we fight for our thing. And where we're at right now is 5. And that is way better than other proposals that were on the table that would have completely eliminated personal cultivation and caregiver cultivation for patients in California. So we're at least keeping some ground in this regard. This actually brings something up, and I see we're getting close to the end. And so if you have a question, please type it in while I'm giving this final thought here, because we're 8.5 minutes from the end of this broadcast. But I want to mention in California, we have a unique model, a collective and cooperative association model. The state legislature said that patients and caregivers in California can associate collectively and cooperatively to grow medicine and provide it back in 2003. That model goes away under AB 266. And that can be a bitter pill to swallow for patients and caregivers and collective and cooperative associations in California. But I want to encourage everyone to think practically about this. If we create a state licensing model for commercial medical cannabis activity, and the benefit of that, of course, is that all of these people in the commercial model, the growers, the providers, the transporters, the employees who actually do the day-to-day work, they're all going to get immunity and protection under state law. But we can't do that if there's this giant gaping loophole for the commercial cooperative and collective model. And so we need folks to come out of the shadows, into the light, into the mainstream, and become businesses or organizations in California that are regulated. We can't carry on. That collective and cooperative model is untenable on the long term. Now, I would like to see in California a preservation of the non-commercial collective and cooperative model. That's not on the table right now in these bills, and I think it should be, and we're still asking for it. But as of right now, we're going to sort of turn a page. You know, back in 1996, we created the patient caregiver model. In 2003, we created the collective and cooperative providers model. And now in 2015 and 2016, we may be creating a brand new commercial licensing model that provides for medical cannabis. And we can make it work. And that may be a great segue into sort of some concluding comments on these bills, is that not all of this is perfect. I don't like all of the things I see in here. I don't like the local bans. I don't like the taxation. I don't like some of these provisions. And yet, we're getting what we can get and we're moving forward. And I do believe on the balance that AB 266 is a step forward for medical cannabis patients and is an achievable goal for the medical cannabis industry. And so I want to encourage everyone to be really pragmatic about this and to really think about what we can get and not about what everything we want to get in the state legislative process, because the state legislative process is not terribly transparent. It's not necessarily fair and inclusive, and it's not always exactly what it is that we wish that we were seeing. And so sometimes we have to step back from what we want and accept what we can get. And that's really what I see with AB 266, is that there's some compromises we have to make right now in order to move forward. And I believe if we keep doing that, and we keep being pragmatic, we can make a real progress in the state of California. One more question popped up before I wrap up. It says, will delivery services be given transitional licenses under AB 266, or were those only meant for storefront dispensaries? And that is a very detailed question. And the sad answer is no. The only time that delivery service would be given a provisional license is if a city or county has already approved that delivery service. Now, an approval will include a business license. And so if you're a delivery service and you have a business license in the city or county where you're located, yes, you can get a provisional license. I think most delivery services don't. And delivery has been a really, really hard topic here. We've been fighting very hard for the right for delivery, because if cities and counties can ban, we need delivery. And as of right now, frankly, that's quite up in the air. But the provisional licensing for delivery services will only be for delivery services that are already approved by a city or a county. And so that's kind of ambivalent news. Now, remember, this requirement to obtain both your state and your local licensing does not kick in for 18 months. So it's not a situation where all delivery services have to close down as soon as the state bill passes. It's just a situation where basically the days are numbered. And so that's why it's going to be so important. And so moving forward, and that's actually a good segue into what comes next, moving forward in California, we're going to have to keep fighting these legislative battles, but what we're also going to have to do is to fight these local battles. And so I want to encourage everyone to stay really plugged in this campaign, because a lot of what we're going to have to do in 2016 is to fight those local battles. And so getting plugged in with our discussion list and with the California Campaign for Safe Access is going to be a really, really important part of doing that. I also want to point out that whether or not legalization is moving forward in 2016, and I want to really drive home this point, it is not a guarantee that marijuana will be legal in 2016, but even if it is, that does not guarantee that patients' rights issues are off the table. And so I want you to stay plugged in the grassroots campaign, because we don't know what's going to happen with patients' rights under a voter initiative. And one thing I'm really, really concerned about, and I want to talk about on Tuesday, September 8th, when we have our next live Google Hangout for Americans for Safe Access, are patients' rights issues, especially patients' rights issues that are related to medical cannabis patients and opiate drugs, because I'm hearing a lot of feedback from patients who cannot get their opiate drugs. They're being asked to choose between their opiate drugs and medical cannabis. And just like the organ transplant victory this year, this may be the next frontier for equal access to healthcare for medical cannabis patients in California. So even past the legislative process this year and the legislative process next year, we still have work to do. And those are the kind of details that legalization does not speak to, or does not necessarily speak to. So we got to stay plugged in on that. We are almost out of time. I want this to be a 1-hour broadcast, because frankly, that's maybe a little too long already. So I want to thank the people who asked questions. If you have other comments or questions, make note of those websites that I was just showing you. You can put those on the Google page, you can put those on the YouTube page, and we will do our best to get back in touch with you. What I really want to encourage you to do, though, in closing tonight, is to get in touch with your state lawmakers and tell them that you support regulations. We're not over the hump on any of this. The Appropriations Committee is our next stop for all of the regulatory bills, and these bills cost money. And a lot of bills go to appropriations and they die because they're too expensive. And that's the role of the Appropriations Committee, is to find out of all the policy decisions the legislature made what we can afford. And so we need a robust support for the regulatory process, even if we don't agree about all the details. So these bills can move through appropriations to the floor for a final vote and to the governor's office for a signature. And that is what we need to actually move the ball forward in California and move us on to those next steps, because it is time in California for regulations for commercial medical cannabis activity. So thank you again for being with me. I don't see any more comments, so I'm going to wrap it up tonight and say thank you for being a part of this. Thanks for participating in it. I want to invite you back for our next live Google Hangout, which again is on Tuesday, September the 8th. It'll probably be at 8 p.m. again, so be a part of that. And keep an eye on our mailing list for news about what's happening. You're going to see some action alerts coming out really soon in opposition to AB 243 and in support for sensible commercial regulations in the state of California. Thank you so much. Check out our website at americansforsafeaccess.org for more information, and I will see you guys next time. Good night.